Hello, this is Thinking Out Loud with Ian Currey. This is an old Morse key I used to use when I worked as a radio officer. Dots and dashes created from this key traveled around the world and back, so you could say I was once an international broadcaster. These days, communication is so much easier, isn't it? And yet, at the same time, it can be much more difficult to communicate an idea well, can't it? Come on, let me tell you what I think. The word broadcasting is much older than radio or TV. It comes from use as a way of sowing seeds in a field by throwing them or scattering them widely. Broadcast, the word, was then later adopted to describe the widespread distribution of information by print, and it got used with newspapers and news sheets, although that was less common. Of course, later, scattering radio or television signals was bound to make use of such a great word, and that's how we know it today. There's a picture hanging in our dining room painted by someone who worked alongside me in the broadcast industry. I'd asked my team to sum up what we did as simply as possible, and this is what he came up with. It was his first attempt at painting, and I rather like it. The idea of scattering seed, an idea, and then watching and waiting for the idea to grow and take root is exactly what broadcasting is about, isn't it? But Morse code is a very simple language, and that was one of the first things that was ever transmitted by radio. With a simple sequence of dots and dashes, you can say just about anything. At the start of today's program, I sent just one word. There, did you get that? Let me break it down for you. 4 dots, that's H, 1 dot, that's E, then dot dash dot dot gives L, and then dot dash dot dot another L, then 3 dashes, that's O. So, hello. There are all sorts of shortcuts and abbreviations that we use to speed things up, but typically we were communicating at around 22 words a minute or so. But the code itself was only one part of the process. Morse code was transmitted in a very simple way, but it needed some clever science to make it get where it needed to go. As operators, we would choose radio frequencies that we knew would bounce off of different ionized gas layers. That's the layers above the Earth. And we could choose specifically which layer we wanted to use to bounce our broadcast. And then we could make it go to exactly in the world where we wanted it to go. The higher layers, of course, would make the bounce go further, while the lower layers, the signal would come back to Earth sooner. And since radio waves, just like light, travel in a straight line, we could choose frequencies that would work with specific layers we wanted to use as a reflector. And then we'd bounce the signal over the horizon and far around the world. At night, the signals would bounce off of different layers, and they would be higher layers, and so the signal would go much further around the curve of the Earth. It's all very complicated. We had to choose frequencies very carefully. I expect some of you have experienced this without ever knowing what was going on when you perhaps used to hear a faraway medium wave station on your radio, and it would be just after sunset and you'd hear a station that at other times you simply couldn't hear. As a little boy, I remember listening to a radio program called Listen with Mother. I was surprised to find it ran all the way from the 1950s right up until 1982. I thought it was only on when I was a child. It always started the same way, with the announcer saying, "This is the BBC for mothers and children." And then before the story, which was my favorite part, the storyteller would say, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." Back then, the internet didn't exist yet, and so radio was much more important. But there's something that I think changed because of readily available communication, where communication is now on demand. Let me explain. As a boy, after listening to the story from Listen to Mother, I could go outside and play and meet a few friends in the street. And we sometimes were able to retell the story or play act parts of it. One of us would be the mouse and hide while the big cat would look for us. And because we'd all heard the same story at the same time, we all knew how the roles were supposed to go and who would get eaten by the big cat. We used our imagination to add mental pictures, and the well-told stories stuck in our minds. I can remember them all these years later. As I make these thinking out loud videos, I'm keenly aware of this. Gone are the days when we all heard the same thing on the radio with our mum listening, or even watching the same TV programs collectively. While we're now spoilt for choice, it may be that we've lost something somehow. And it might turn out to be important in that communication process. Now, instead of being able to talk about the ideas we all learnt with those around us, family, friends and so on, perhaps we are now more dependent on our own individual ability to judge the validity of content. There certainly seemed to be something of an advantage in that collective thinking and discussion back then. What were some of the favourite shows and programs you grew up on? What did you watch and listen with your friends and family? I'd love to hear the ones that made an impression on you, but be careful. Some of these shows will date you neatly. Hilary says one of her favourite programs was Little House on the Prairie, which it made across the Atlantic to Ireland when she was still at school. There was no TV in her house, so she visited a neighbour and they watched it together each week. Hebrews chapter 10 has something to say about this idea too. Let me show you. And let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do, but encourage one another, especially now. As I grew up with a job that often had me working on Sunday, some of my rather religious friends would show me this verse and try to encourage me to go to church. They meant well, I'm sure, but there seems to be much more to this. The verse looks like a continuation of a thought, not something to be thrown around on its own by congregation head counters. The verse starts off with the word "and." Let's look and see what's hiding right before this verse, the part that was usually not passed on when I was in trouble for not being in church. Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. Oh, now that's a rather different story, isn't it? Let's think of ways to motivate one another and meet together to do that. And that's just as with the ideas we acted out and talked about together as children after listening to the same radio story. The idea here may be of encouragement and intentionally coming together regularly to motivate each other, as the writer puts it, to acts of love and good works. Do you remember Miss Evans and how I described how she was very intentional in the way she did things? And you can see that story in the video called Old Friends if you missed it. The verse that describes how Miss Evans operated is found in 1 Corinthians. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadowboxing. Intentional. When we meet together with our friends in the way the writer of Hebrews seems to be describing, to motivate one another, we have to be intentional and purposeful about it. There's not much point in meeting if we just sit in straight rows without that intentional behaviour of encouraging one another. Now, is there? Do you have a group of people that's there to help you and motivates you in this way? Perhaps for you this happens at church, and for others it will happen in smaller groups, perhaps of good friends. Whatever the case, it's important that we are intentionally meeting and encouraging one another and motivating each other. But there's another important aspect of communication, isn't there? Do you remember I said my favorite part of the radio program was the story? Well, that is still true all these years later. I love a good story, don't you? You might have heard people who work in the communication industry say things like, content is king and keep the main thing the main thing. Well, at least the good communicators will know that for sure. What we communicate is vitally important, especially when we're trying to encourage others as they follow Jesus and motivate their friends to do the same. As always, there's good instruction in the Bible for this too. We really are going backwards today through this short section, aren't we? Look at the verse before the ones we've already looked at in Hebrews chapter 10. Look at verse 23. Let us hold tightly, without wavering, to the hope we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Do you see how that connects to the other parts of the passage? Holding on tightly to the hope we have sounds like someone might need a little help getting things together, doesn't it? I get the idea someone's hanging on for dear life, hoping they're not going to fail at something. Sounds to me like they need encouraging, don't you think? Putting the thoughts together in the right order, the short passage summed up says, don't give up, hang on, God can be trusted, and meet together to motivate and encourage each other. Now, that looks a lot to me like that group radio listening we did as children, where we could all work the story out together. The content we are communicating, though, is perhaps better spelled out in another place in the Bible, in Colossians, in chapter 3. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, or since you're following Jesus, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about things of heaven, not the things of earth. When you meet, think about things of heaven. That's another key communication skill, isn't it? Keeping the main thing the main thing. So often in groups, the topic of discussion can drift to those things that prompt chatter and ends up in, oh, isn't it awful? And would you believe it? When I hear those things, I tend to think someone might be spending too much time looking at bad news instead of focusing on the things of heaven. I'd love to hear how you're meeting together with people who encourage you and motivate you as you discuss things you've read or heard together. Are you being intentional about doing that? You can tell me in the comments or in those emails you're sending me, but don't do it in Morse code. If you click on the subscribe button and the bell icon, you'll see the next video in the series pop up when it's released. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.